He was standing at the side of the stage, not performing, not rehearsing, holding a glass he had not touched in 20 minutes. Frank Sinatra was 3 tables away. The room was full. The room was loud. But between those two men, something had gone quiet. Dean Martin did not look at him. That was the tell. Dean Martin always looked at everyone. He was the kind of man who made eye contact with the coat-check girl, and the waiter, and the band leader, and somehow made each of them feel like they were the most important person in the room. That was not a technique. That was who he was. And that night, he was not doing it. They had been friends for more than 20 years. They had shared stages, dressing rooms, late nights, and silences the kind only men who have built something together understand. And now Dean was standing at the side of his own stage, holding a glass he would not drink. In a room he could fill without effort, looking at everything except the one man who mattered. Something had been said, not that night, not in public, but something had been said. And the 7 words that changed everything between them had not come from an argument. They had not come from a fight. They had come from somewhere quieter than that, from a place where one man decides what another man is worth, and then says it out loud, in a room full of people who would remember. This is not a story about 2 entertainers. This is a story about what happens when one man you trust tells the truth about you, and the truth is not what you expected. And you have to decide what to do with it. And you decide to do nothing. And nothing turns out to be the most permanent thing of all. Dean Martin was born Paul Crosetti in Steubenville, Ohio, in June of 1917. The town was steel and smoke and men who did not discuss what they felt. His father was a barber. His mother kept the house. The neighborhood was Italian and Catholic and practical. Nobody in that neighborhood talked about dreams. You worked. You showed up. You did not make a scene. Dean learned early that the best thing a man could do was make a room feel good. Not talk about it. Not explain it. Not perform it exactly. Just do it the way you breathe. He dropped out of school at 15. He worked in a steel mill. He dealt cards in an illegal gambling house. He boxed under the name Kid Crochet. He lost more than he won. None of this was the plan. There was no plan. There was just the next thing, and then the next thing after that. By the time he was in his mid-30s, he had already built one career and dismantled it to start another. The partnership with Jerry Lewis had made him famous. Walking away from it in 1956 was supposed to finish him. Everyone said so. The columnists, the producers, the people at parties who knew how things worked. They were certain it did not finish him. He built the second version of himself slowly. The drink, the ease, the cigarette, the way he looked at an audience like they were guests in his living room. It was a performance, yes. But the best performances are the ones where the performer forgets it is a performance. Dean had that. He walked out with a glass in his hand and made you feel like the night had just gotten better. That was the job. He executed it every single night for 40 years without once explaining what he was doing. You know that feeling when you have been somewhere so long that people stop seeing you. When the room knows your name but not your weight. When the applause is real but the attention is habit. Dean had that in his 30s. He had outgrown the ceiling of the partnership before the partnership was over. And he had stayed. Because that is also who he was. Frank Sinatra was different. Frank wanted things. Frank wanted them perfectly on time and without discussion. He ran the Rat Pack the way a general runs an operation. With affection, yes. With loyalty, yes. But with a clarity about who decided what that was never spoken and never needed to be. You know that feeling when someone in your life sets the terms for a friendship, and you agree because the friendship is worth it. And then one day you realize you have been agreeing for a long time, and you are not sure when agreeing became the default. Dean had that feeling for years. He just never named it. He was not a man who named things. The two men met in the late 1940s. By 1960, they were inseparable. The Sands Hotel in Las Vegas was their headquarters. The shows at the Copa Room sold out before they were announced. Sammy Davis Jar, Peter Lawford, Joey Bishop. The whole operation. But it was Frank and Dean that the room came for. Frank was the headline. Dean was the reason it felt like a party. That difference mattered. Not on the marquee, in the room, in the difference between being respected and being loved. Frank was respected the way you respect a force of nature. Dean was loved the way you love your favorite uncle. Both of these are real. They are not the same thing, and both men understood this. One of them was comfortable with it. The other one was not. But something was building in those years. Something no interview caught. Something you can only find in the pauses, in the accounts from people who were in those dressing rooms. In what Dean said, and more important, in what Dean did not say. The question that nobody asked out loud was this: what did Dean Martin want? Not for the show, not for the Rat Pack. What did Dean Martin want for himself? That question had no clean answer, and the absence of a clean answer was exactly where the trouble lived. Here is what nobody ever talks about. Dean was not unhappy in the Rat Pack. He was good at it. He was natural at it. But there is a difference between being good at something and owning it. Frank owned the Rat Pack. Frank owned Las Vegas in a way that went beyond contracts. When Frank called, rooms were arranged. When Frank had a problem, problems were solved. When Frank decided something was happening, it happened. Dean watched all of this. He participated in all of this. And he was, by every account, genuinely fond of Frank. But fondness is not the same as agreement. And Dean Martin was a man who knew the difference between the room seeing him and the room seeing him standing behind Frank. In 1962, Dean signed his own contract with Reprise Records. Frank had founded the label. This was Frank's house. Dean was a resident. It was generous. It was real. And it was in a way that nobody said aloud. A reminder of how the architecture of their friendship was built. Who had built it? Whose name was on the door? That same year, Dean had the largest solo television audience of his career to that point. The Dean Martin Show would not begin until 1965. But he was already demonstrating something. That he did not need the ensemble to fill a room. That the thing people came for was not the Rat Pack. It was Dean. Frank knew this. Frank was not an unobservant man. He was, in fact, one of the most observant men in any room he entered. He had built a career on reading rooms, on knowing exactly what a crowd needed before the crowd knew it. He applied that same precision to the people around him. He watched. He assessed. He formed conclusions. And once Frank formed a conclusion, it was very difficult to change. And this is the first place where the story becomes something other than what it appears to be on the surface. Why did Frank, a man famous for loyalty, begin to say certain things, in certain rooms, to certain people, about the one man in his orbit who had never given him cause, who had never been late, never been unprepared, never publicly embarrassed anyone, who had, by every external measure, been exactly the kind of friend Frank said he valued most? Why then, three accounts exist. A producer who worked both the Rat Pack performances and Dean's solo television specials. A session musician who worked recording sessions for both men throughout the early 60s. A manager who was present at the Sands in 1963. They agree on one thing. Frank had opinions about Dean Martin. Real ones, private ones, not for the press, not for the act. Opinions about what Dean Martin actually was underneath the ease and the glass and the loosened tie. Opinions that had been forming for years, and that had finally, in the early 60s, found their way into the open air. On everything else, the three accounts differ. Now see it from Frank's side. Frank had built something real. The Rat Pack was not just an act. It was a statement about a kind of American life. About men who had made it, who stayed loyal, who showed up for each other when it mattered. Frank believed in that with everything he had. Frank needed to believe in that. And Dean was the one who could take or leave it. Dean was the one who would rather be home in Beverly Hills, watching westerns and playing golf, than rehearsing another set at the Sands. Dean showed up. He was professional. He never embarrassed anyone. He never let anyone down. But his absence of need was, to Frank, something that looked like a lack of investment. Frank was wrong about that. But Frank was not wrong that they were different. Frank built his life around the idea that loyalty meant performance. You showed up. You were present. You were visible. You made it clear, constantly, that you were committed. Dean's loyalty was quieter. It did not perform itself. It did not announce itself. And Frank Sinatra had real difficulty trusting a loyalty he could not see and hear and feel in a room. This is where the trouble was not an argument. It was not a specific night, not a specific fight. It was a long, slow difference of understanding about what it meant to care about someone, about what caring was supposed to look like. And then, sometime in the early 1960s, it became something with words. The session musician was the one who was closest to the original room. He said Frank had been talking about a performance, not complaining, analyzing. Frank analyzed performances the way engineers analyze structures. He wanted to understand why something worked or did not work, and he was talking about Dean, about a specific set, about the way Dean had walked through something that Frank would have rehearsed for 2 weeks. And Frank said it, quietly, matter-of-factly, the way a man says something he has been thinking for a long time. He said, he does not care enough to be great. 7 words. Not an insult about ability. Not a complaint about professionalism. Something more precise than that. Something that went to the exact center of what Dean Martin was, and what Frank Sinatra could not understand about it. He does not care enough to be great. The producer who was present said Frank said it the way a man states a fact he has confirmed to his own satisfaction. Not with frustration, not with anger, with the tone of someone who has thought about something for a long time and finally said it out loud. Like closing a file, the musician who heard this secondhand said it reached Dean within 48 hours. Not from the producer. From someone else. The way these things always travel, through a third person, on a Tuesday, in an ordinary phone call that became the call. Dean heard it. He did not call Frank. He did not bring it up at the next show. He did not address it with Sammy or Joey or anyone in that circle. He did not write about it. He did not, in any interview that exists, address it directly. What Dean Martin did was go quiet. Not visibly, not publicly. He kept performing. He kept showing up. He kept walking out with the glass and the tie and making every room feel like the best Tuesday night of your life. But something had been rearranged. The room looked the same. The furniture had moved. You know that moment when someone you respect says something true about you that you did not want said. Not something false. Something true. And the truth is wrapped inside a judgment you did not ask for. And you cannot argue with the fact, because the fact is real. But you can feel what it means for that person to have said it. That you have been seen. and that what they saw was not what you needed them to see, was not enough. The manager who was present at the Sands said Dean's performance did not change. His professionalism did not change. His warmth with the crew, the band, the other performers, none of that changed. But the manager said there was one thing. Dean stopped waiting for Frank after shows. Not dramatically. Not in a way anyone would notice from the outside. He just stopped waiting. He would finish, go to his dressing room, change, and be gone before Frank's set ended. For years he had stayed. After those 7 words, he did not stay. Dean Martin had 2 choices. Call Frank, have it out, make it a conversation, a confrontation, something with a resolution. Or decide that some things, once said, cannot be unsaid, and go on. Most men would have called. Dean Martin was now most men. Here is the question nobody ever asked out loud. Was Dean's silence a form of pride, or was it proof that Frank was right? Drop a comment. 1 line is enough. If stories like this are the kind that stay with you, subscribe. We find the moments that history almost forgot. What Dean did in the months after those 7 words was not what anyone expected. And it started, of all places, with a television show that nobody, including Frank Sinatra, thought he could carry alone. The Dean Martin Show premiered on NBC on September 16, 1965. Frank did not think it would work. This is documented in more than one account. Frank's opinion, shared with at least one producer and the session musician who worked both camps, was that Dean needed the ensemble, that the casualness and the ease and the drinking and the jokes, all of it required a frame, required other people. Without Sammy, without Peter, without Frank himself, Dean would be exposed. Whatever was underneath the performance would show, and Frank was not sure there was anything underneath. Frank was wrong. He was more wrong about this than about almost anything else in his professional life. The show ran for 9 years, 264 episodes. At its peak, it was the 3rd highest-rated program in America. Dean walked out every single week with a glass and a loosened tie and made 30 million people feel like they had been invited somewhere, not to a performance. His room, on his terms. He did not explain himself. He did not try. He was, in the most technical sense, doing exactly what Frank said he did not do. He was not caring enough to be great. He was simply being great, without effort, without announcement, without needing a single person to confirm it. That is the part Frank could not account for. The show ran while the Rat Pack era faded. It ran while Las Vegas changed hands and changed music and changed its whole identity. It ran while Frank's career went through its own turbulence. The years where the audiences shifted and the younger crowds had different names on their lips. And Dean, the one who did not care enough, was the one who showed up 264 times and made it look like he had just wandered in from the parking lot. Here is the part that gets left out of every version of this story. Frank's 7 words were not wrong. Dean did not care the way Frank cared. Frank rehearsed until rooms changed shape. Frank worked with a fury that people who witnessed it still struggled to describe decades later. Frank needed the performance to mean something larger than entertainment, larger than a Tuesday night, larger than 30 million people eating dinner in front of a television. Frank needed it to be proof of something. Dean needed the performance to feel like the best Tuesday night you ever had. Both of these are real forms of greatness. They are not the same form. And Frank, for all his intelligence, for all his extraordinary capacity to understand what a room needed, could only recognize one of them, the one that looked like his own. The producer who was in the room later said, in a conversation that was not published until 1981, that what Frank had expressed that day was not contempt. It was something closer to grief. Grief that someone with that much talent did not suffer for it, did not bleed for it. Dean made it look effortless. And Frank could not separate effortless from careless, could not find the seam between the two. That was the misrating. That was the 7 words. That was the distance it created between two men who had been, in every real sense, the closest thing the other had to a mirror. If this story reached something in you, the like button is right there. It takes 1 second, and it tells the algorithm that stories like deserve to be found. Not for me, for the next person who needs this story. Stay with it. In the years after those 7 words, Dean and Frank continued. To the outside, nothing had changed. The performances continued. The friendship continued. They appeared at benefits together. They did the telethons. They were photographed at tables in Las Vegas, laughing the way men laugh when the cameras are there. In interviews from that period, Dean talked about the show. He talked about golf. His handicap had dropped. He talked about his children. He had 8 of them. He talked about everything except the era. When a journalist from Life magazine pressed him on Frank directly in 1967, Dean smiled. He said Frank was a great man. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he changed the subject. That was the tell. Dean Martin never changed subjects unless a subject was finished. Sammy Davis Jr. noticed, he said, in an interview from 1969, that Dean and Frank had a different kind of thing now. He did not elaborate. He was asked to elaborate. He said, "You know how some friendships get to a place where they work better with some space in them." Then he moved on. When everyone in a room stays quiet about the same thing, that is not loyalty. That is an agreement. Joey Bishop was more direct. Not in public. In a conversation with a journalist that was not published until years after the Rat Pack had dissolved. He said Dean had heard what Frank said. He said Dean never brought it up. Not with Frank. Not with any of them. He said that was the most Dean Martin thing Dean Martin ever did. He just decided it was already over and kept going like it was not. Here is what that cost. Dean Martin was a man who had built his entire professional identity around not needing anything, around the ease, the glass, the loosened tie, the way he looked at an audience like he was doing them a favor by being there, and doing himself a favor by being there, and everyone got to share in that. All of that communicated one thing: I am here, but I am not desperate to be here. I can take this or leave this. That was the power. That was the performance. And the one person who was supposed to know that this was a performance and not a character flaw, not a lack of investment, not an absence of care, was Frank. Frank was supposed to know the difference. Frank, who had been in this business alongside Dean since the rooms were smaller and the stakes were different. Frank, who had seen Dean in dressing rooms at 2 in the morning, not performing for anyone. Who had seen Dean with his children. Who had seen Dean on the nights when the glass was empty and the ease was not a performance, but simply the man. Frank had looked at all of that and decided those 7 words were the true account. Dean heard them. And Dean, who did not perform his feelings, who did not call people to process his hurt, who settled most things internally and quietly and permanently, made a decision. He would continue. He would show up. He would be professional and fond and present in every way that could be seen. But something had been rearranged inside the friendship. Something that would not be rearranged back. In 1972, Dean gave an interview to a journalist named Tom Burke. Burke pushed him on the question of the Rat Pack, on Frank, on what that era had meant. Dean was quiet for a moment. Then he said this: Frank is the best I ever saw at needing something. I never needed it the same way. That is the difference. He did not say it with bitterness. He did not say it with grief. He said it the way a man explains a fact he has had a long time to make peace with. The journalist noted that Dean's expression did not change when he said it, that he looked, if anything, at ease. 7 years after those 7 words, 1 sentence, no performance, just the account, closed. Dean Martin's son, Dino Jar, was killed in a military training accident in March of 1987. He was 35 years old. He had been flying with the California Air National Guard. The plane went down in the San Bernardino Mountains. What happened to Dean Martin after that loss is its own story. He canceled his remaining tour dates. He did not perform publicly for a long time. He lost, by every account from people close to him, the engine that had run him for 40 years. The ease was still there when he tried, but the reason to try had gone somewhere he could not reach. What is relevant to this story is one thing. Frank Sinatra called immediately. He was at Dean's house within hours. He stayed. Whatever the 7 words had done between them, whatever the quiet rearrangement of that friendship had built up over 25 years. Frank was there, at the door, in the house, in the room, and Dean let him in. This is important. Dean, who had not waited after shows. Dean, who had given 1 sentence in 1972 and considered the account settled. Dean, who had built 264 episodes of proof that he did not need anyone to confirm what he was. That Dean let Frank in. There are no quotes from those days. Nobody reported what was said inside that house. Nobody wrote about what it looked like. But people who were present said Frank came back, more than once. That he sat with Dean the way old men sit when there are no useful words, and they know it, and they sit anyway. In 1993, Frank and Dean announced the Together Again tour. Liza Minnelli was the third. The idea was a farewell of sorts, a celebration, a last run through the rooms they had built. It lasted less than a year. Dean left the tour in July. The official reason given was exhaustion and health. Both of those were real, but multiple people close to both men said something else. Dean was done, not with Frank, with performing, with the thing itself. He had, quietly and completely, stopped needing it. And when you stop needing something, continuing to do it becomes a different kind of work. The kind Dean Martin did not know how to do. The kind that had never been in his vocabulary. The tour ended. Dean went home. He played golf at Riviera Country Club. He watched westerns in the living room. He had dinner with his children and his grandchildren. He did not tour again. He did not want to tour again. He was finished. Not broken, not diminished. Finished the way a man is finished when he has done what he came to do and knows it. Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, 1995. He was 78 years old. He died at home in Beverly Hills. The city of Los Angeles dimmed the lights on the Las Vegas Strip that night. The lights on the Sands, the hotel that had housed the best years, had already been dark for some time. The building was demolished in 1996, a month after Dean died. Frank Sinatra died in May of 1998. He was 82. He died at Cedars Sinai Medical Center. His last word, according to his wife Barbara, was, "I am losing." They did not have a final conversation that anyone recorded. There was no public reconciliation. The 7 words were never addressed between them in any form that survived. What survived was something else. After Dean died, Frank's health declined quickly. People who were with Frank in the final 2 years said he talked about Dean. Not about the performances, not about Las Vegas, not about the Copa Room, not about the movies, not about the tabloids. About Dean. About the ease. about the way Dean had something that Frank had spent his entire life trying to manufacture and never quite could. You cannot manufacture ease. You cannot rehearse it. You cannot carry it into existence. It either comes naturally or it does not come at all. And Frank, in those final years, finally quietly understood this. He does not care enough to be great. What Frank had looked at and called a limitation was the thing itself. Dean's greatness was not despite his ease. It was the ease. It had always been the ease. The man who spent 40 years making rooms feel like a gift was giving the gift the whole time. Completely, without effort. And that, to Frank, in those last years, looked like something close to a miracle. The kind you do not recognize until it is gone. Before this ends, think about someone in your life. Someone who did something well and made it look effortless. And think about whether you trusted that. Or whether you looked at the ease and decided it meant they did not really care. Did you say something about that? Out loud. In a room where it would travel? Or did you keep it quiet and let it become the version of that person you carried? Tell me in the comments. If this story reached something in you, subscribe. Not for me, for the next story. Because the next one is about a man who gave everything to be trusted by someone who never fully could. And it is heavier than this one. This is not a story about 7 words. This is a story about what happens when one man cannot read another man's love because it does not look like his own. Frank Sinatra loved through effort, through rehearsal, through fury, through presence and need, and the constant insistence that the thing you were doing mattered, and therefore you had to make it matter with everything you had. That was his language. That was the only language he trusted. Dean Martin loved through ease, through showing up without needing to, through staying in rooms he could leave, through a loyalty that performed nothing, declared nothing, asked for nothing back, and was therefore invisible to a man who needed loyalty to announce itself. That gap is the story, not the fight. There was no fight, not the falling out. They never fully fell out. The gap, the quiet, unbridgeable gap between two men who cared about different things in different ways and could not find the language to translate. Think about someone in your life who showed you they cared in a language you did not speak. And think about whether you understood them, or whether you said 7 words, or thought them, or let them become the version of that person you carried for the rest of your life. You would know exactly what Frank felt. You would know exactly what Dean felt. Because you have been both. Everyone has been both. Loyalty is not about intention. Meaning no harm and doing no harm are not the same thing. The people we lose are rarely lost in a single moment. They are lost in the quiet decisions we make after. In his final years, Dean Martin kept a photograph on the side table in his living room. People who visited him in Beverly Hills in those years mentioned it. He did not explain it. He did not talk about it when people asked. He just looked at it the way a man looks at something he has made peace with. Not with grief, not with longing, with the quiet recognition of something that was real and was now finished and did not require anything more from him. Frank said he did not care enough. Dean spent 30 years being exactly what he was, not to prove Frank wrong, not to anyone, just by continuing to do the thing the way only he could do it. That was Dean Martin. That was the man who walked into every room like the night had just gotten better. He never asked to be understood. He just kept going. And the rooms kept filling, and the glass stayed in his hand, and the light stayed on, until they did not.